In September of 2023, I gave a talk on the horrendous situation that whites in particular, but also coloureds and Asians in South Africa, find themselves in as a result of ANC rule. A link to that talk has been posted in the comment section to this video. The perilous plight of whites especially, but also coloureds and Asians, is on account of the racist mindset and racist policies of the ANC, which is intent on making life so unbearable for non-black ethnicities that these groups will eventually decide to leave South Africa. Today, in 2025, I am compelled to talk again about the monstrous rule of the ANC. Because recently, the ANC introduced a shocking and horrific law which will allow the South African state to seize privately owned land without paying compensation to the owners. Echoing what the tyrant Mugabe did in Zimbabwe, with catastrophic consequences for the Zimbabwean population, this law is aimed at white farmers, who constitute a vital source of food production in South Africa. Needless to say, Western politicians and Western mainstream journalists, who present themselves to the world as the defenders of human rights, private property rights, the rule of law, and civilization, are silent concerning this loathsome new law in South Africa. It is at this stage that I should say that many blacks are also victims of ANC rule. Amongst other disasters, law and order has virtually collapsed in South Africa because, in part, of the catastrophic economic policies of the ANC, the gigantic levels of corruption in the ANC, and the vast numbers of immigrants from other parts of Africa whom the ANC has imported, with all too predictable results for social cohesion in the country. Accordingly, black-on-black crime, including violent crimes such as murder and rape, is off the scale. And yet, not one word is mentioned about this by Western politicians and Western mainstream journalists. Evidently, black victims of ANC rule are the wrong kind of blacks. They are an inconvenient truth which undermines the West's projection of a South African Potemkin village. Beyond that facade lies one of the most violent and dangerous of countries on the planet. Suffice to say, 31 years of ANC rule constitutes a catastrophic chapter in the history of Africa. And suffice to say also, many blacks despise the ANC. With the ANC's introduction of the appalling new land law, life in South Africa has taken another turn for the worst. The Boers, who are Afrikaner farmers, feed the South African population. The Boer man is a brilliant farmer and one of the finest in the world. How ironic it is that ANC leaders enjoy their breakfasts, lunches and dinners by the sweat of his brow. But therein lies the unbalanced mindset of the ANC. The racially bigoted attitude of the ANC towards the Boer, indeed towards Afrikaners in general, and whites in general, is so uncontrollably deranged that ANC leaders are prepared to bite the hand that feeds them. And more than that, by aiming to expel Boers from their rightful farms, the ANC is willing to cause a famine in South Africa, which would engulf all ethnicities in the country. And if you think that to be far-fetched, then think again. Because a terrible precedent exists. As a result of Mugabe confiscating the land of white farmers, calamity struck the people of Zimbabwe. because like their Boer counterpart, white farmers in Zimbabwe fed Zimbabwe. Indeed, those outstanding farmers once fed not just Zimbabwe, but the whole of Africa. So much so that Zimbabwe, and before it Rhodesia, was once known as the breadbasket of Africa. But all that changed when Mugabe stole the land of white farmers, which produced two results. First, famine struck the Zimbabwean population, with starvation continuing to plague the Zimbabwean people to this very day. And second, Zimbabwe went from feeding Africa to having to depend on the continent for food for itself. How prophetic Rhodesian leader Ian Smith's warnings about Mugabe were. Returning to South Africa, if the ANC manages to steal the land of white farmers, then famine in the country is inevitable. And let me say this, if such a scenario materialises, every government in the world that has not condemned the ANC for introducing its dangerous new land law will be complicit in the ensuing famine. The world has been warned. There is another point which I would like to make. The ANC, along with other repugnant political parties in South Africa, such as the Economic Freedom Fighters, headed by the odious Julius Malema, who publicly sings about killing Boers, regularly gives speeches which are full of racist tropes about white people. Namely, they say that all of South Africa's problems today are on account of whites, a reference to the apartheid period. This unsubstantiated, ludicrous and pathetic accusation is dangerous, as it is inflammatory, with the inevitable consequence being that it gives rise to further violent physical attacks on whites, especially Afrikaners. But let us just, for a few moments, entertain the accusation. In 1994, the ANC inherited a South Africa with a prosperous economy, excellent infrastructure such as motorways, a highly competent civil service, high-level health and education sectors, an effective criminal justice system which produced a safe society, and a powerful and revered military. Under ANC rule, all of that has been laid to waste. ANC policies have decimated each and every key institution in South Africa, bringing the country to its knees. In 31 years, the ANC has achieved one success and one success only: failure. Interestingly, a parallel can be drawn with Rhodesia. The Rhodesia that Mugabe inherited from Ian Smith was a success story. But within a very short period of time, that success story became a story of failure as a result of Mugabe's calamitous and, quite simply, useless and deranged policies. Another heinous aspect to ANC rule is the murderous attacks on Boers. Since the ANC came to power in 1994, over 3,000 Boers have been savagely murdered on their farms by methods which are gut-wrenching. If you are not aware of this brutal reality, then I urge you to familiarise yourself with it, as it is one of the most shocking and bestial of ongoing acts in contemporary times. The Witcroos Monument is dedicated to the white farmers who have been murdered on account of the colour of their skin. The monument is comprised of over 3,000 crosses, each one representing a slain farmer. It is an extremely upsetting monument to visit, with new crosses erected on a regular basis. And what has the response of the ANC been to the murder of white farmers? Well, no ANC official has ever visited the Witcroos monument to express condemnation of the murders and to lay flowers there. Need I say more? Let me now turn to the Afrikaner. The Afrikaner has long commanded complete respect and admiration from me. The Afrikaners are devoted to God, devoted to their family and friends, devoted to their people, devoted to their culture, and devoted to their land. The work ethic, organisation, efficiency, hygiene, orderliness, and methodical nature of the Afrikaner is impeccable, indeed exemplary. Throughout their history, the Afrikaners have faced, endured, and overcome severe threats, threats which many other tribes in the world would not be capable of contending with. The most lethal threat which the Afrikaners have faced came from the British ruling elite during the Second Anglo-Boer War, when approximately 400,000 British Empire troops failed to defeat approximately 50,000 Boer commandos. The British ruling elite attempted to commit genocide against the Boers in order to win the war. Thus, the British ruling elite invented concentration camps, rounded up Boer women and children, including babies, and sent them to these camps, where over 30,000 died agonizing deaths. I urge you, if you are not familiar, to learn of the heroic and selfless work which the indomitable Emily Hobhouse carried out in relation to bringing world attention to what the British ruling elite was doing to Boer women and children in those concentration camps. Faced with the terrifying prospect that the British ruling elite was intent on carrying out mass murder of Boer civilians, the Boer commandos surrendered. Accordingly, the British ruling elite won the Second Anglo-Boer War, but only by the most depraved and unforgivable of means. Man for man, the British soldier was incomparable to the Boer commando. The names Joseph Chamberlain, Alfred Milner, and Herbert Kitchener occupy the darkest page in Afrikaner history, for these three vile individuals were steeped up to their necks in Boer blood. But in spite of the murderous behaviour of the British ruling elite during the Second Anglo-Boer War, the identity, self-belief and spirit of the Afrikaner remained intact. In that respect, the British ruling elite failed. If we now fast forward to the present day, it is abundantly clear that the threat posed to the Afrikaners by the ANC is comparable to the threat posed to the Afrikaners by the British ruling elite. Whilst the methods differ, the objectives of the ANC today and the British ruling elite back then are the same, namely to subdue and eradicate the Afrikaner presence in South Africa. And so, the Afrikaner will struggle on, as the Voortrekkers did. I believe that if the Afrikaner was able to survive the genocidal endeavours of the British ruling elite, who continue to be the most malignant elite in history, then the Afrikaner can survive the heinous endeavours of the ANC. But the existence of the Afrikaner should not and must not be taken for granted. I encourage you to spread the word about the plight of the Afrikaner. After all, awareness is a powerful weapon, especially in the age of social media. At a time when the cultural and spiritual values of Western nations face oblivion on account of the evil, and I use the word in a biblical sense, on account of the evil forces which rule the Western world, from monarchies to aristocracies to banking elites to Zionists and so on, the loss of the Afrikaner would be a terrible blow to those of us in the Western world who are battling to preserve our national identities in the face of evil. The loss of the Afrikaner would also be a terrible blow to mankind and civilization. Further to that, before people comment on South Africa, I suggest they acquaint themselves with the real history of this complex part of the world, not the simpleton history put out by Western mainstream media, Western mainstream historians, Western politicians and Wikipedia. Suffice to say, those politically motivated and utterly unreliable so-called sources will never provide an impartial and factual history of the Afrikaner and the Boer, because by doing so, this would undermine the official narrative of those who rule the Western world. In addition to that, let it be known that the British ruling elite played the cardinal role in Mugabe's rise to power. Indeed, the British ruling elite facilitated the transfer of weapons to Mugabe's terrorists and thugs in their savage attacks on certain black tribes in Rhodesia, as well as on the Rhodesian security forces. I have always been a friend to the Afrikaner, and I always will be, no matter what. I stand proudly and in solidarity with the Afrikaner, who is one of the finest of tribes in the world. God bless the Afrikaner, God bless the Boer, and God bless South Africa.